Slave breeding, medical experimentation, and human trafficking, analogous to those with which Tuskegee is associated, scattered over centuries in countries worldwide, not only the Americas. Slavery is such an abominable sin that some would rather forget, but that is the truth that must be kept alive. Chapter upon chapter in human history is logged in red ink of vast suffering and injustice. These stories have often been buried because of tales of progress, but we must unearth them to reflect on the past and so that such atrocities will not happen again. So with that in mind, let us take a journey of remembrance and commemoration for all who have gone through the harsh slavery eras. Take a look at 25 haunting historical facts about slavery. Please thumb up this video if you enjoy it, and subscribe for more thought-provoking lectures. Fact number 1, slave breeding. To describe the horror of this, it was inspired by the ending of the Atlantic slave trade. With an inability to import more slaves from Africa, those in control got together and contrived a disgusting means to grow their slave labor and profit from it. Slave breeding is the systematic forcing of enslaved people to produce more children for the purposes of increasing the owner's wealth. Good slaves were selected by the masters and mated with the desired characteristics, such as physical strength and a possibility of being fertile. They even rewarded some incentive to women who bear many children and punished those who were defiant. This abominable practice ripped apart families and denied basic human respect. Such children, in most cases, were torn from their mothers at a tender age and either sold or made to work. Fact 2. Medical experimentation during the antebellum United States. Enslaved individuals are majorly used as experiment tools for several painful and risky procedures done without their consensual agreement, their bodies being looked on as safety resources for medical research studies. One such benefactor was Dr. James Marion Sims, a proclaimed father of modern gynecology. Sims carried out numerous experimental operations on enslaved women under excruciating pain and risk jeopardizing life, yet without the use of anesthesia. Legally, he was only required to get consent from the owners of the enslaved women. One woman who was in his holding, Lucy, went through painful experiments in which other doctors only observed. His procedures on Lucy had no success and almost took her life due to blood poisoning at an unbearable level. All this did not deter him a bit from continuing to experiment on other enslaved women, sometimes even drugging them to avoid unrest. Another patient, Anarcha, was an enslaved teenager on whom he performed at least 13 operations without anesthesia before he could perfect a technique that he was satisfied was safe to use on white patients. Enslaved patients like Lucy and Anarcha had no right to refuse treatment or withdraw consent. Medical exploitation was their lot. From slavery and after, physicians denied Black people basic dignity and personhood, persistent in the myth that Black people felt less pain than white people. Although Sims was historically hailed as a medical hero, today more and more people realize he was a torturer of Black women. This reappraisal led to the complete removal of Sims' statue from Central Park in New York City in April 2018, but he still has another statue which remains at the Alabama State Capitol. Fact 3. Hunting for runaway slaves used the help of fierce dogs. Tricky about them problem runaways had is that they were difficult to track and catch without some threat. Thus, plantation owners employed some fierce dogs which they had specially bred to hunt the runaways. These dogs were mostly crossbred with heavy breeds, mainly bloodhounds and bulldogs, to track, attack, and capture runaways with the naked menace. These dogs were inducted with a reign of terror in the hearts of the enslaved, totalizing how brutal and dehumanizing the slave system was. As is often seen in twisted exhibitions of power, the slave owners allowed these dogs to go on and maul the captured runaways before being restrained, resulting in grievous injuries. This practice served not only as punishment, but also as a chilling warning to others who might contemplate escaping. Fact number 4. The Zong mass killing. In the year 1781, the captain of the slave ship Zong ordered 132 enslaved Africans thrown overboard and drowned on their way to Jamaica. Back in England, the ship owners filed for compensation from the loss of their cargo with their insurer. The case could have been a successful one but for Alada Equiano, a former slave who lived in England at that time. He somehow came to know of the Zong massacre and informed it to one of his abolitionist friends, and a case was registered in court. Firstly, the court decided in favor of the ship owners, citing their arguments as that the Africans were just like animals and have to be killed if the people fear for the safety of the ship. However, the insurance company KD an appeal, and during the rehearing, the enslaved Africans were finally accepted as human beings and not property. Fact number 5. a black man owned slaves during the 17th century. Anthony Johnson was a black who was brought to Virginia as a servant with a specified term of service. He managed to purchase his freedom after his term of service and later on bought land and went ahead to legally own another black man, John Kaser, for his entire life. Some have used this to argue that it was based on economic issues rather than racism, as a black man was also a slave owner. Such an interpretation is, however, quite misleading. The first reported case of lifelong enslavement in the colonies was that of John Punch, a black man who was condemned for life servitude for trying to escape his indenture in 1640. His white co-workers were given only extra years of service, which articulates in 1640 unequal treatments toward blacks. Johnson's descendants were eventually dispossessed of their land and most likely lost their freedom to increasing anti-black racism in the colony. While the story of Johnson was somehow unique, he has mostly been used to try and twist the story to downplay claims of racism in Americans. Fact number 6. Enslaved people were branded just like cattle. Branding was one cruel practice major slave owners engaged in throughout history to mark their enslaved people, the American one included. It was all about teasing and dehumanizing them, really, plus it facilitated identification. As this is a very old practice, it was utilized for the extreme use during the transatlantic slave trade. Abolitionists pointed out the brutality of branding in order to reveal the inhumanity of the slavery. The methods were several, though the heated iron was the most common method. Meanwhile, there are also instances when the acid and powder of guns were also used for this purpose. Branding caused permanent physical and psychological damage to the enslaved person, who had to bear the mark as a perpetual reminder of their subhuman status. Some slaves even attempted to change or mutilate their brand marks as a form of hostility and resistance. Fact: #7 Africans actually sold slaves. The Atlantic slave trade created an intertwining trade network where African kings and traders were also active participants in the slave trade. Fellow Africans, most of them being prisoners of war, would be sold to the European slave ships. It was never a one-way of traffic, as African leaders had in return for their valuable spoils from Europe, especially weapons, for their prisoners. These presented ways for new conquests, therefore creating a vicious cycle of fighting and enslavement by Africans. The first trade deals entered into between Europeans and Africans were those of ivory and gold, but the demand of slave labor in the Americas changed the dynamics of the commodity to that of enslaved Africans, henceforth a valuable commodity. This in other ways had the damaging impact of continuous conflict and instability in African societies. Civil War: the Underground Railroad developed as a series of safe houses that helped enslaved people to freedom. In response, a retaliatory network, the Reverse Underground Railroad, developed. This was a system of kidnapping runaway slaves as well as free blacks from the North, taking them to the South and reselling them into slavery. It was very hard for the kidnapped free blacks to prove their freedom, since the courts were biased against them and their papers were easily disregarded as forgeries. Furthermore, being unable to testify against whites meant that they could barely say anything in defense against such laws. The Reverse Underground Railroad serves as an epitome of the constant danger of re-enslavement that black people faced, even within the so-called free states, and the way the legal system was rigged against them. Fact 9. The best slaves were those men who had reached the age of 25 years. Profit-driven slaveholders gave enslaved people the cheapest minimum to survive on and made them work all day from sunrise to sunset. Indeed, girls were prized more than boys until adolescence because of the ability to bear children who also would wind up enslaved. However, the prized possession of a master was the male of approximately 25 years, perceived energetic and able to work harder. Notably, this regardless decay of human life and placing individuals into the pool of commodities is evil. It clearly reflects that the practice of slavery dehumanized people. It was their potential to be economically exploited, not their intrinsic value as human beings, which made the slaves so valuable. It was this commodification of human life that went to the heart of the slave system, shaped the kind of world those who lived as slaves would experience that world, and assured the perpetuation of that system over time. Fact number 10. Slave owners had a different kind of Bible. Determined to evangelize the enslaved population of the British West Indies, they set about producing for them, at reasonable cost, a heavily expurgated version of the Bible, which ran to little over half the length of its full-text version, in order to omit the parts that could be of no possible use to them and might much incite them to rebellion, such as the story of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. and instead to dwell on those which confine the condition of slavery in a supposedly neutral light, such as Joseph's slavery. It's just that the slave Bible was one item in the toolbox of manipulators against the enslaved population, a certain idea of wiping out the will to revolt by omission of the passages that would mean a way out of servitude or liberation to those slaves. The creators of such a spurious text should have intended it for the enslaved to believe there was acceptance in being subjugated. That is one twisted act of religious censorship that makes it very plain how far those in command would go in holding their grip on the reins and quashing dissent. Fact number 11. Fleeing slaves were mentally ill. Pro-slavery American South physician Samuel Cartwright instead used his medical knowledge to argue in favor of the institution of slavery and published a report stating that blacks were biologically inferior to whites with smaller brains and immature nervous systems and are naturally fit for servitude. He even said black people can only be happy in slavery. In one of the most crass attempts of pathologizing resistance, Cartwright described a mental disorder that he called drapetomania, that he said caused slaves to try to run away from their masters. He described treatments for the non-existent condition that were inhumane, such as whippings and amputations. Fact number 12. Another mental illness of the slaves was their tendency towards laziness, according to them. Not content with having invented drapetomania, Samuel Cartwright considered it insufficient and went on to fabricate another fictitious mental disorder called dysesthesia aethiopica, which he claimed caused laziness in enslaved people. According to Cartwright, this condition resulted from decreased sensitivity of the skin, leading to sluggishness, which could be attributed to a dearth of effort. He paradoxically said that the illness was more common among free black individuals because they lacked masters to take good care of them. His prescription was to wash the infected skin, grease it with oil, and make him work relentlessly in the sun, at the end of which he would be grateful. Fact 13. Blacks were being arrested for unemployment. The emancipation that came after the Civil War created economic disbalance in the South, whose economy was heavily dependent on slave labor. However, the 13th Amendment left a loophole that, despite otherwise abolishing slavery except for punishment for a crime, was heavily exploited by the Southern states. They unabashedly and haphazardly began to imprison Black Americans for the smallest of reasons, for mere vagrancy or joblessness, and subsequently leased these convicts to private businesses for free labor. This system of convict leasing more or less replaced slavery by subjecting over 200,000 Black people to brutal working conditions and inhumane treatment. Dangerous jobs were carried out by these hired convicts through rough conditions, undergoing beatings and chains. In simple words, Black people have been arrested for doing nothing. Fact number 14. The continuation of the illegal slave trade. Even after its formal being abolished, the slave trade never stopped and kept on minting huge profits for the traders. During the 19th century alone, millions of enslaved Africans were shipped across the Atlantic, often aboard American vessels, revealing the continued complicity of governments and corporations in this reprehensible trade. The havoc wreaked on African societies by the criminal trade had created higher levels of violence, instability, and economic breakdown. The capture and forced migration of millions of people disrupted communities, fueled conflicts, and hindered the development of local economies. Fact 15. Slave quarters were terrible. Slave quarters were the housing provided for the enslaved individuals on the plantations and farms during the period of slavery in the U.S. These types of housing varied greatly in design based on location, time era, and wealth of the slave owner. One-room wooden or log cabins with dirt floors and few amenities typified the majority. Many enslaved people were housed in larger structures, often divided into units, while others lived in tiny, converted outbuildings. Overcrowding, poor construction, and a lack of basic sanitation were common, thus leading to unsanitary conditions and the spread of disease. These severe living conditions gave rise to many health problems and inflicted psychological trauma. The desperate situation of the enslaved was worsened by the lack of autonomy and privacy. Fact 16. Slave codes. Laws representing how the treatment of enslaved people as property in the United States operated, the slave codes. Designed to shield the slaveholder from losing property due to resistance or violence, they severely restricted the rights and freedom of enslaved people. This included even their movement, assembly, education, and family life. Additionally, the threat of slave rebellions was always a concern for the plantation and slave owners. So as years went past, harsher and more punitive slave codes were enacted. These codes were not just for the regulation of the behavior of those in bondage, but through them, the legal definition of one's status and race was determined as well. For this reason, under such codes, any person of African ancestry was considered black regardless of whether they were free or enslaved. Secondly, the status of a child was a matter of the mother, whereby a child would be considered enslaved if his mother was, even though his father was free. The specifics of slave codes did not match up in every colony or state, but all shared the goals of the legislation to rescue the institution of human enslavement and the racial hegemony for which it was a prop. Ultimately, these reduced enslaved individuals to the status of chattel and sentenced them to a lifetime of servitude and exploitation. Fact 17. Internal slave trade. In 1808, the United States Congress prohibited the importation of African slaves, and that felt like a step forward for justice for Americans seeking to abolish slavery. It actually proved more like a progressive action undertaken on one's own. However, it inadvertently gave rise to a domestic slave trade, a system of cruelty, forcing members to tear apart families and displace an estimated 1.2 million, most born in America. This domestic trade was to persist as a long shadow in the lives of enslaved people, permeating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty in their lives. The prospect of being at any moment torn away from all they held dear and sent into the hellish conditions of Louisiana sugar plantations, with their brutal labor conditions and attendant high mortality rates, was too horrible to contemplate. Fact 18. The Underground Railroad. Back in the slave era, the Underground Railroad symbolizes the paths of travel and refuges that enabled enslaved African Americans to escape from the southern to northern layers of states of America. Of course, that term was metaphoric. There was no real railroad, and it was in no sense underground. It facilitated long-distance escapes, moving through homes, barns, churches, and businesses. Individuals who made up the Underground Railroad worked with an abiding sense of the need for justice and the removal of exploitation through slavery, risking life and liberty to take the enslaved to a life of freedom. It helped nearly 100,000 people in bondage between 1810 and 1850 find freedom. The conductors moved runaway enslaved people from one point to the other along the routes. The safe houses where they were hidden were referred to as stations. The people who sheltered the runaways were station masters. The people fleeing were passengers and cargo once they reached the safe houses. Fact 19. Slave labor in urban and rural settings. Enslaved persons worked not only on rural plantations, but were also part of the urban labor force in Boston, New York, Charleston, Richmond, and Baltimore. The institution of slavery itself spread throughout these diverse settings. Enslaved people worked in urban areas in domestic service, skilled trades, and industrial labor. They were blacksmiths, carpenters, seamstresses, cooks, and washerwomen who economically developed these cities. Although they were indispensable to city life, enslaved people in cities faced certain issues, particularly lack of opportunities for social betterment and greater control and surveillance. Fact number 20. Resistance in the fight for freedom. Enslaved Africans never stopped waging the battle for freedom. Their spirit never ceased to die, and their act of resistance allowed others to know that hope was never lost under the fingers of oppression. They returned this violence in both small acts of defiance and large rebellions. In both small heroisms and grand struggles, they have willed populations to fight for their own liberation. An excellent example is the case of the Haitian Revolution of the late 1700s, where enslaved people from the French sugar colony of Saint-Domingue made a bid for independence and finally overthrew French rule. They called their nation Haiti, and after that, there were many other revolutions that eventually freed all of France's colonies from slavery. Fact 21. Slave ship resistance and revolts. Because of continuous miserable, harsh treatment and unbearable hurting, the stout and defiant spirits of men, women, and children under the most extreme, at times, life-threatening circumstances on board, many enslaved Africans did not hesitate to retaliate by embarking on revolt after embarking. An estimated 10% of all voyages experienced a serious uprising, most often occurring off the African shore. They resisted in a number of ways, withholding food and water, jumping off the slave ships, and even trying organized armed uprisings. The resistance, met with fierce repression, made slave traders increase the means of security, inadvertently raising their cost and limiting the number of voyages they took. Fact number 22. The chilling effect of Nat Turner's rebellion *****. Nat Turner's 1831 insurrection in Virginia set fears quaking through the breast of the slaveholders. The deaths of some 55 white people by an orderly rising, with its striking leadership of a large collective of black men, cast the first bright gleam of truth on the power of the palace over the slave regime. After the rebellion, paranoia rose and brutal reprisals against enslaved people erupted all over the South. States began putting stricter slave codes into laws, which were limitations on the freedoms and rights of slaves. The rebellion also added more fuel to the fire between the arguments of slavery, establishing a greater gap between the pro- and anti-slavery factions found in the United States. Fact number 23. The East African slave trade continued into the 20th century. While the United States effectively stopped the slave trade in 1808, the East African slave trade, otherwise known as the Arab slave trade, lasted much longer. No one in the larger Indian Ocean community saw it as in any way immoral or illegal, whoever practiced it. Over 1 million slaves were taken from East Africa during the 19th century alone, and despite British efforts to suppress it, the trade continued into the 20th century. The ability to do so goes on to re-establish that the mode of slavery is global, and the process of reversal, which was finally put to an end, mostly went on very slowly with huge time lags in different parts of the world. Fact number 24. The horrors of the Middle Passage. It was the Middle Passage, a nightmarish transatlantic voyage, a living hell to all entrapped in its clutches. Dragged from homelands and stripped of all dignity, men, women, and children were stowed below the decks of slaver ships, naked bodies in chains and branded like livestock. The smell of human stool mixed with the sour smell of disease filled the hold of the ship as the slaves suffered unimaginable horrors. Death became an everyday reality for this harrowing journey, with an estimated 12% of slaves dying on the way. The severity and desperation were of such levels that they sparked innumerable incidents of rebellion, all attempts answered with deadly swiftness and mercilessness, in the effort to somehow still grasp onto whatever remained of their lost freedom. And lastly, number 25, modern slavery. In our modern world, slavery hasn't disappeared. It has simply changed its face. It now goes by the names human trafficking, forced labor, and forced marriage rather than by chains and plantations. Humans are deceived, coerced, or even born into lives where their freedom is stolen from them and exploited for someone else's profit. This is not a horror story from times past, but an unfortunate reality for an estimated 49.6 million people today, a number that has become unbearably high for children. Knowing very well that poverty, lack of education, and having been born in regions of social instability are faced by some groups of people, these horrors apply to them the hardest. Slavery today takes on many forms and occurs in all parts of the world. The chains of the drivers have become so long and complex that it's nearly impossible to hold businesses accountable. This is exactly why strong legislation with acting authorities, together with global cooperation, is needed to cast light on the dark ones and defend the vulnerable. The National Referral Mechanism in the UK is working tirelessly to identify and support victims, proving that the fight against modern slavery is happening on our own doorsteps. But this is a global issue, and each of us has something to do to make sure every human being is given the chance to live free from exploitation. It is fighting for freedom, dignity, and values that form the essence of humanity. We have just gone through 25 eye-opening facts about slavery, but the commemoration must not end with this video. Humanity will keep on remembering those who have inherently fought against their chains and whose stories are filled with pain and bravery. We learn so much from past horrors and current injustices. It will move us to action. Still, we have to keep learning, raising awareness, and fighting hard to bring exploitation around the world to a halt. We owe this to those who have gone before us to make it possible, the abolitionists and the enslaved themselves. It's only through collaboration that the much-needed world in which all human beings will be genuinely free can be created. Thank you very much for watching till the very end. If it's your first time here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Keep the conversation going in the comments section, and if you liked it, share it out with your friends. We can't wait to see you in the next one.